In this clip, I'd like you to take away some ideas about how to conduct an audit of your classroom and then some strategies that you can use that would adjust your practice. So this one is really focused on making sure that what we're doing in the classroom is actually accessible for the student. When I use the phrase interpreting audit, this is a bit of a new concept for many school districts. But what it means is having somebody who is a consultant come and look at what's going on in the classroom to determine whether it's possible to interpret. In earlier clips, I've said that sometimes we've thought that absolutely hiring an interpreter means that everything is accessible, but it's not true. And so somebody doing an audit can help you to look at, is the language being used accessible for the student? Are there processes that teachers are doing that inadvertently make it impossible for the deaf student to participate? And so an audit can point out problematic contexts, and it can give you, the teacher and the interpreter, some additional information in order to manage the classroom dynamics. Again, drawing on the work of Betsy Winston, she's the first researcher that really spoke to understanding that there are some things that are not interpretable. And that's a different concept because, again, many of us have bought into the belief that a sign language interpreter is equal access and that absolutely everything can be interpreted. If you speak another language, you'll know that there are lots of phrases that you struggle to put in a separate language. Some things just don't translate between two languages, but other environments also are not constructed to make it at all possible to interpret. So basically we look at 4 ways of the audit. And so I could come in and say, your classroom, given what you're doing, it's possible to interpret. I could also say, it's possible to interpret in this classroom if we did some modifications. I might also say to you, I think it's possible to do some interpretation, but only if we do some major, significant modifications to teacher practice. Or I might come in and say, really, this is not a class that is interpretable, and so therefore shouldn't be interpreted. And so let's talk about some examples for those. So a classroom that would be interpretable is one where teachers have a pace where it's possible to provide language interpretation, where interpreters are preparing with teachers, so they've got a good handle on the content, where there are structured ways of students engaging with the teacher so that it's not everyone speaking at the same time, where there aren't very many what we would call dual task demands, where we're asking the student to look at the board and read something while I give additional instructions. So environments that are really sensitive to the nature of interpreting, that could be interpretable. Interpretable with modification, you know, if I've got a group discussion and I see that a teacher just isn't managing the conversation, but if she chose to have a talking stick, or she chose to say one student at a time, if she chose to repeat questions before she answers them, that's a classroom that probably, with some minor modification, could be more interpretable. Significant modification might be something like really helping the student and the teacher to recognize when it's a dual task demand and when it's just not possible for the student to participate in the classroom. So reducing the dual task demand. So that might be the major modification that we ask for. Not interpretable. A couple of classrooms that I've seen recently are classrooms where the pace is very, very quick, where teachers are basically reading, so it's not natural language use, where there are accents, either on the behalf of the teacher or other students, and where classroom processes, there's lots of interaction and none of it's managed. Those situations, it's really impossible to interpret. The other thing that makes it possible or impossible to interpret well would be paying attention to interpreter ergonomics. What do I mean by that? I said in an earlier clip that interpreters can get injured when they do many, many hours of interpreting. And so having a proper chair with a proper back and a footrest is one of the ergonomic features that can support effective interpreting. If I've got a bad chair, what happens by the end of 2 or 3 classes is that I start to slouch. Anytime I start to slouch, that has an impact on the quality of language use. If I start to fatigue, that also has a huge impact on the quality of my sign language use and the quality of my attention to what's the message that you're producing. Interpreter ergonomics can also mean things like stretches, warm-ups. Those can be key pieces of staying healthy. And the cognitive stress and the physical stress. So when environments are not very interpretable, so everybody's speaking at the same time, and I just don't know who to interpret, that can create cognitive stress for me, which manifests as physical stress, which then results in further risk of injury. But it also creates then differences in what the language looks like, and so it's likely that I'm going to pick up the pace and produce something that really doesn't make any sense in sign language, but yet if you look over you'll see me signing, but the deaf student doesn't have any access to it. So when we do audits, we also look at the work-rest ratio. And by that I mean, let's say that in your classroom you have a 15-minute introduction to the particular content or lesson, then there's some small group interaction for another 10 minutes, and then there's some independent work for another 10 minutes. So in that first 15 minutes, I'm actively working. In the small group interaction, I'm actively working. In that independent work, I've got a rest. And so we look for that work-rest ratio in terms of trying to determine whether an interpreter is at risk and whether it's interpretable or interpretable with minor modifications, because it may be that we shorten the content of active working periods and we intersperse that with other classroom activities. An interpreting audit can also reveal that we might need 2 interpreters. And so, for example, high school, 80-minute classes, 80-minute classes back-to-back, heavy academic demands typically requires 2 interpreters. Doing a class play that's going to be an evening performance that the student's participating in, it's a 2-hour event, might require a need for a team interpreter. And so there are lots of ways for us to audit what's the context that we're asking to be interpreted, and then what's the best solution for that to happen. Let me turn my attention now to some other things that I think you can do directly as the teacher. One of the first things that we ask teachers to do is to speak directly to the student. So it's not about tell him or tell her when you're dealing with the interpreter, but deal directly with the student. And to know that everything that you say will be spoken in sign language, and everything the student says will get interpreted to you as well too. So it's not helpful for you to say to me, the interpreter, don't interpret this, I don't want the student to know this. Really, if the students have access to everything else that's going in your classroom, then everything has to be interpreted. So know that that will happen. But there may be times that you see the student sign to the interpreter and you don't hear that actually voiced. That might be a place where a deaf student's asking for a clarification of a particular sign, or it might be a place where the deaf student's just asking for a quick repetition. And so the interpreter will probably make a decision that I'm not going to interrupt you as the teacher to tell you that, because that gets managed in the process of us working out the interpreting. Sometimes teachers tell me, well, the student doesn't really need an interpreter in this situation, so the interpreter can be off in this period. Well, if you think you don't need an interpreter in a certain situation, but you don't actually sign, and you actually don't understand interpreting, and you've never taught a deaf student before, I'd really ask you to be careful about that decision. Ask the student and the interpreter before you make that decision on your own. Some other tips, allow for clarifications in the classroom. One of the teachers that I interviewed recently said, you know, I don't like having a deaf student in the classroom because they're constantly putting their hand up and asking for repetition. Well, it doesn't mean that you've got a lousy interpreter. You've got an active deaf student who is looking for accurate information. It may be a signal that there's some problems with the interpretation. It may mean there's some problems with the interpreter's cognition and understanding of the content, or it may be that you've got a really active deaf student. But either way, we've got to be able to allow for that if we're going to encourage a deaf student to be an active participant. If you can repeat the questions before you answer them, that allows me to process the information, because I will always be a little bit behind you, even though it looks like it's simultaneous. If I'm going to understand what you're saying, I've got to use what we know as processing time. So I'm going to be several seconds behind where you are. So by repeating the question before you answer a student question, that's just so helpful to me. Lessen the dual task demands is on your slide as another tip, and really, I mean, if you want the students to take notes, allow for a bit of extra time for the deaf student, but don't ask them to take notes and then watch the interpreter while you give additional information about what's on the board for them to take down. That dual task is one of the things that's not interpretable. And I guess allow extra time for the students when they're accessing it via interpretation. What we know about good teaching is that we ask teachers to pause for much longer than they think they should in order to allow all students to have an opportunity to answer, not just those students who immediately have the answer and their hand flies up. And the deaf students processing the information through interpretation, which is a slower process. And again, depending on the cognitive load for the student, depending on their own language abilities, we've got some additional challenges. So allow for that extra time for them to be able to process and then choose to answer. I think it's wonderful if you can learn some signs. And so when we talk about learning some signs, I'd like you to learn some signs for social greetings. How do you welcome all of your students to your classroom? Learn that in sign language. Some signs for feedback that aren't just this. This is typically the sign that lots of interpreters and teachers use as their fallback. But when I listen to you giving feedback to students, I hear you say all kinds of things, and so the interpreter needs that same rich repertoire. But you could also learn some other repertoire for providing feedback directly, which fosters that relationship with the student. I said in an earlier clip that I'd like you not to leave the teaching decisions to the interpreter, but I'd like you to access consulting support, and so that might be through somebody like Linda Cundy. It might be accessing other consultants that are available to you who know something about working with a deaf student. I think the biggest thing that you can do as a teaching strategy is to manage the talk time. And so I love interactive classrooms. I love when I see lots of student dialogue and interaction. But recognize that your classroom is bilingual, 2 languages, and bimodal, a different language form. And so I need you to manage that. And I need you to manage that in a purposeful way, because if you don't, the interpreter by default then is making decisions about whose voice is the loudest voice heard. And yet, often, it's the student who I might find irritating as an interpreter, who really has wonderful insight that might really click with that deaf student. And so we don't want the interpreter to be making those decisions. I want you as the teacher to manage that overlapping discourse. Because when it's overlapping discourse or it's rapid, then that does not serve the interpreter well, and it won't serve the student well. So pause more often. I think in terms of constructing your lessons, if you can also think about the fact that your deaf student is watching an interpreter 6 hours out of every day. The visual fatigue point is very, very severe for a deaf student. And I think most teachers don't plan that into their day. So are there points when the interpreter isn't working and the deaf student doesn't have to watch the interpreter? No matter how good they are, they're going to need lots of visual breaks. And so can you balance the small group activity, the individual activity, the large group activity with the visual fatigue that they experience? Pacing is a huge piece of your own language use, and so we know again from the data that the most effective interpreting done by the interpreters who were effective were the ones that knew the teacher intent, but the teacher's language use was at a pace that was really manageable for interpreting. The pace that I'm speaking in these videos I hope is manageable for the interpreters, but sometimes we get rapid fire speech, and all of us can use speech in a really quick way, but again, it makes it less interpretable. So if you can repeat important vocabulary, if you can repeat and rephrase important information, if you can be using lots of visual information so that the student accesses it in other visual ways, not just through interpreting. So key vocabulary on the board, visuals on the board, visual handouts that can be referred to. Anything that again helps the student have other visual opportunities to manage the pace of the information. Turn taking is on your slide as well too, but the piece that's on your slide that's new that I haven't said yet is I'd like you to explicitly name all of the students. I can't tell you how many deaf kids classrooms I go into and they talk about the fact that they don't know any of the names of the students because they don't have a relationship with them and they have no idea what their names are. So if you can work with the interpreter to be able to help the student to know the names of the other students and make some modifications about that. I said in an earlier videotape to use caption video as much as you can. And what I'd also like you to be able to do is to be able to use material that allows for a deaf-centered curriculum at times. So allows for that deaf life to be represented in really positive ways. So that might be class presentations that speak to a deaf hero, a deaf role model. It might be contributions to science by deaf scientists. I saw a brilliant presentation recently given by a scientist in the United States where he talked about over the history, last 300 years of science, what have been the contributions of deaf and hard of hearing people. There were all kinds of scientists that I didn't know that were themselves deaf. That would be a great way of infusing some deaf-friendly content. ASL poetry, when we're looking at poetry lessons, websites that have actual signing. Recently I was in a classroom where they were using current events, so they were using a 1-minute moment from the British Broadcasting Corporation and a YouTube clip. It might be interesting for your deaf students to know that the BBC actually has 6 deaf translators who work full-time and provide translation for their websites and their news. So could you show a 1-minute clip of a deaf translation in British Sign Language, but nevertheless gives the student a chance to say, there's somebody like me in a really important role. I've got some ideas about role models on there, and again, I don't expect that you will know lots of deaf adults, but again, reach out to those of us who do so that we can give you some ideas about ways to present that role modeling content. Success stories versus can't stories. I think that one of the things that is a constant theme for many deaf children working in an interpreted environment is that they get a message that they can't do things. Well, we don't have enough money for the interpreter, so you can't go to that event. No, we can't have you on the sports team with an interpreter because we can't afford that. No, you can't go to that conference because we don't have interpreters, even though the rest of the students can choose to go to it. No, you can't go on the field trip to Mexico and build houses because we can't send an interpreter there. That can't eventually becomes a piece of learned helplessness then. And so can we counter that with all kinds of success stories of where we can make it work well? A little bit more about visual access. Again, in your classrooms, pay attention to the lighting and the windows because you don't want shadows on the interpreters. And if you're showing videos and you turn off all the lights, it's impossible for the deaf student to access the interpreter. So you're going to have one band of lights on or have lighting. Positioning, an important part, so the interpreter may want to move around the classroom with you at times. The interpreter may want to stand beside you. The interpreter may be seated for some of it. So positioning is a constant piece of thinking about where is the best place for the interpreter to be visible right now. If you notice that the interpreter is wearing something that looks like this piece of clothing today, that would not be typical of an interpreter because, again, I said that the child's accessing it visually 6 hours a day. So good interpreters know that the solid background is the most accessible and the less visually fatiguing. If your student is deaf and blind, you'll want to be able to find out which colors work best for that student. And often it's the 3/4 sleeves and often it's brown or black. Sometimes they cannot access a blue or a green, but again, you'll want to be able to figure out with the interpreter what's the appropriate clothing. I know that some of us, hop out of bed pretty early and end up in clothing that we shouldn't have, but can you work with the interpreter so that there's an outfit constantly at school for those days that they forget? Because it's very, very fatiguing. Even though we think it's not, it's very fatiguing for the student to watch something on a very busy background. In terms of creating your relationship with your student as well, some of the teachers I've seen at lunchtime, they're actually using a keyboard and they're talking back and forth with the deaf student. That's a great way of creating a direct connection. Some teachers in the older years are emailing back and forth with students, again using text that's not mediated with an interpreter. Sometimes if there's an iPad in the classroom, they're accessing an iPad and using that. One of the teachers that I saw recently that I just loved, she had talking sticks. It was a younger classroom, and so she had every student's name in a jar, and throughout the course of the day she would be sure to pull out each student's name so that she'd been in touch with each student throughout the course of the day. But she had the deaf student's name in there 5 times, and when I asked her about that, she said, it's the only way that I can really see if they're with me, and so I'm monitoring their comprehension, plus I'm hoping that they get an opportunity for increased opportunities to participate, because we know that this is not an environment where they typically get to participate. So I think that that teacher was really, really sensitive to some of the tiny little things that can be done. Again, feedback signs, social greetings. There's lots of ways that we decorate our classroom, but most of the time when I go into a classroom with deaf children, there's absolutely nothing visual that shows sign language is welcome here. And so again, some of us put little stickers up that say a safe space for our environments. Can we have a safe space that's a signing space? Can you think about all the wonderful visuals? And there's tons of them that are really bright and colorful. Can your students learn some survival signs? You know, when you've got a music lesson, can you pull up a video from Deaf Performing Arts Network, which I know you're familiar with now, that has some signed media that's done by deaf performers, not hearing people using sign language, but deaf performers adapting music with sign language. So again, all of those pieces, while they are part of creating a deaf-friendly environment, they're also part of, I think, creating a really welcoming and positive relationship with the student. I think as a school district and a school community to think about ways that you could be using technology. So there might be some ways to be using Skype and accessing direct teaching. There might be some ways for you to access some regular coaching. So to have your teaching observed by a master mentor teacher and then get feedback from that teacher. And so it doesn't mean that they have to travel out, but if you can set up Skype, they can observe. Same for the interpreter supervision. That could be done through a distance as well. Language modeling, language support, I think is a really important piece of making your classroom accessible, and so looking for those opportunities. Some schools, I think, are accessing deaf homework support, so helping families to hook up with other deaf adults who can then tutor. So for example, here at the University of Alberta, we have a deaf PhD student who's doing some lovely tutoring with a variety of students. He's a teacher himself, and he's also deaf, and so he's tutoring in all of the academic areas via Skype for a family in Calgary. So there are lots of opportunities like that. I've given you an example on this slide of looking for opportunities for your deaf children to participate in a broader deaf community context. And so Boston every year has a Deaf Children's Arts Festival. And so I was pleased a couple of years ago to be able to attend that festival and see deaf children from BC who had submitted art and who won in that contest as well too. So can you look for those opportunities where the child really gets a chance to succeed and work out some of those can't messages and they become can messages. Your slides also speak to continuous learning and in-service. So obviously these video clips are part of that continuous learning, continuous in-servicing, and to recognize that students that are in schools where there's a significant mass of students then are able to more offer an environment that includes them in that academic, social, and intellectual engagement. And so if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer those for you. But I think the rest of the slides just really give you a summary of that this is a really complicated area to serve a deaf student, that it's not as simple as just bringing in an interpreter, and that you're going to have to adjust some of your teaching practices in order to make sure that the student is an active participant and not a passive participant in your classroom. I'm going to leave it there, and I welcome your questions. Thanks so much.